Over these past few months of the global pandemic, I have been fixated on coming up with new ways to connect and inspire our community. As much of the world is still in lockdown, I have taken this opportunity to connect us through my new podcast series. In today's first episode, I will be going deep into what it would have been like to be a full-time student of Arnold Jacobs in the mid-1960s. My guest is Robbert Tucci, who has been the solo tubist of the Bavarian State Orchestra throughout most of his career. He has also been a very influential designer of tubas and mouthpieces through his current and well-known Parent Tucci line. I recently spoke to him about what it was like being a student of Mr. Jacobs. This is the Steve Rosset Tuba Mania podcast series. How are you, Mr. Tucci?
Steve, it's wonderful to see and hear you, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in your series. You've been very creative and very productive. You've always been creative and productive and took advantage of modern technology. You made a new source of information and energy and enthusiasm. Wonderful. But thank you very much for having me here today.
Mr. Tucci, please tell us about your life and adventures as a student of Arnold Jacobs.
My pleasure. My first teacher was Harold McDonald, the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And Harold was a wonderful musician, a great tuba player, and a great inspiration. And he led me to Arnold Jacobs. And I knew Arnold Jacobs before I ever met him because Harold was a student of his and played with lyricism and virtuosity and a wonderful sound. And also, I knew Arnold Jacobs before I studied with him due to an early recording, the Chicago Symphony Brass Quintet recording. When I heard that, I fell in love with the sound and the artistry and the musicianship. And when I went to Chicago in summer of 1958, Arnold Jacobs was 43 years old. Bud Herseth was 37 years old. And the Chicago Symphony Brass Section had by that time created the modern brass sound of large dynamics and new concepts of sound. And they were famous for that. And this is spread over the whole world now. At any rate, Mr. Jacobs was always cheery, always pleasant, unforgiving. And at that time, he was very involved in his study of the human body, and physiology, psychology, neurology of the human body. Some of the things he talked about were rather scientific, and one student asked him, he said, could you repeat that in English? But what he did, he was very efficient in the use of his time. He had his commitments to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and he always practiced 2 to 2.5 hours a day. And at one time or another, he had upwards of 30 students a week and other responsibilities, his personal study. And it was amazing. He was very efficient in the use of his time and also in the time of his students. What he told his students to do in the correctional advice about breathing, articulation, tone production was always directed to achieving the best result in the shortest possible time. And he played during lessons, and 5 or 10 minutes of that was like a blessing from heaven. To hear advanced tuba artistry and the modern symphonic sound face to face. And there were also very humorous events. I went out to the famous address at 8839 South Normal Avenue in a cloudburst. And when I got there, I was soaked from head to foot. And Mrs. Jacobs took my clothes and put them in a dryer and gave me Arnold's clothes, which were all too big. I had a shirt that could have been a pajama and trousers you could wrap around your waist twice. At any rate, Arnold was down in his basement studio with a bucket. The basement had flooded, and he was bucketing water from his studio into the basement. What he didn't know was that the studio was lower than the basement, and the water that he poured into the basement went through the drain and came back out. But we got that straightened out. very amusing as well. But Arnold Jacobs was a wonderful person, and uh, uh, he. I think it was his, not only his musicality, but the fact that he very loving and careful about his students, and never critical, never critical. Arnold Jacobs never made a critical remark. It was always positive. And the old theory: don't work on the problems, work on the solutions. And as students, we had access to Chicago Symphony concerts, members of the Civic Orchestra, and so what we were taught at a 1 hour lesson on Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday, we could hear in performance on Thursday or Friday. So it was a great experience. In Chicago, here in Europe, you have cities with Munich, for example, with 6 professional orchestras, 2 opera houses, a large commercial music scene, and much opportunity for musicians. But Chicago, a big Midwestern industrial city, commercial industrial city, that orchestra to those people was their life. That orchestra and their students and their life as musicians and teachers, that was it. There was very little diversion for musicians. It was all concentrated on doing what they did well, with their whole heart behind it. It was a unique time. It was a very unique time, Chicago. I was there just for 2 years. Mr. Jacobs found me a job. I became my first job. I played an audition for the Louisville Orchestra, and Mr. Whitney said, "Well, Bob, I'm sure the tuba playing will be all right, but Mr. Hicks, who's leaving the orchestra, was also our property manager." I said, "Mr. Whitney, that's no problem. I can do that too." So I never knew to this day whether I was hired as a property manager or as a tuba player. Yeah. But that was that time in Chicago, and then I always went back to Mr. Jacobs. And the last time I saw him was in September 1998, 3 weeks before he passed away, and he was the same cheery person. He buzzed on his mouthpiece, on his rim, with that wonderful sound that he always had. So from the beginning, 1958, to the end in 1998, it was always a wonderful experience. And together with others, with John Taylor, with Michael Gross, Brian Fredrickson, others, we cultivate the legacy of Arnold Jacobs. He was a great teacher. There were many great teachers. And if you start on the East Coast, you had Vacchiano, you had Roger Voisin, in the West Coast, legends of teachers. Vince DeRosa was a legend, a mountain. So, and Arnold Jacobs was right in the middle. But I think in terms of physiological aspects, and certainly in terms of the tuba, the most advanced teacher at the time, by all means, and to this day remains that. So I commented recently in an article, which is soon to be published, that people who attend concerts benefit from Arnold Jacobs' teaching, whether they know it or not, because many of the people who play in concerts are students of Arnold Jacobs, also, whether they know it or not. So what happened in Chicago in decades of teaching Arnold Jacobs has spread worldwide, and people go to concerts, they hear great brass sections. Some of that was. This is not in lack of respect to other centers of culture or other centers of tradition, other schools of teaching or playing, but he had a massive effect on wind playing, on brass wind playing, massive effect, greater than any other single person.
I'll never forget my first lesson with Arnold Jacobs. He said to me, what sort of surprised me is the person who walked out of his studio before me was holding a bassoon, and this was in 1987, and was dressed, I was wearing my t-shirt and shorts and baseball cap, and was dressed like a European. And I thought, And I said to Mr. Jacobs, I said, "Oh, do you also teach bassoon?" He said, "Oh, that's a member of," I'm not sure if it was the Vienna Philharmonic, but it was a professional bassoonist who had come to Chicago for some lessons over the summer on
Thank you
just
for listening to
breathing.
this episode of my
And I
Tuba
thought that
Mania
was amazing. I
podcast
thought,
series.
wow,
If you enjoyed it,
I'm
please
studying
subscribe.
not only with a tuba player,
Also,
but somebody
consider
who's
viewing
just
the
teaching
video
music
version
to
of this at
wind
the Steve
players of
Rosset
this
YouTube
stature.
channel, where you will also
Arnold
find
Jacobs also
many
taught
more
voice.
resources for tuba
and brass and performances of
he,
myself and
as
others.
far as
I
the
also
oboe and
invite you to
bassoon,
become a member of
in
Tuba Mania
particular the
online,
oboe,
which is free, so you can
he
participate
commented
in
that the oboe
webinars such as
had
the
the
one
highest
with Mr.
resistance for the
Tucci.
player and used
And
the
finally,
smallest quantity
I'd
of
like to
air,
ask you to
and that
consider
the tuba
becoming a
had the lowest
VIP
resistance and
at
used the
my
greatest quantity of
VIP
air, but also
Masterclass
remarked that the
course.
low
The
register of the
information
flute
there could be
requires
found
just
at
as much air, upwards of 30 liters a minute,
www.tubamania.com.
airflow in the low
Thank you
register of the
again
flute.
for listening to
So,
this podcast.
but there were players who had he talked often about the Valsalva syndrome, the fact that people close their throat and create pressure in between the abdomen and the throat. And this was not only tuba players or trumpet players, but also wind players, particularly oboe and bassoon players. Arnold Jacobs remarked that he enjoyed teaching normally talented, enthusiastic people, but that he loved the basket case, a person who was totally hung up. That's what he loved. And he understood and he could help people. Anyone that listened to him did what he told them to do. Anyone could resolve their problems of tone production, breathing, articulation, and resume their careers. That was very interesting because he had people who were very successful. They got into their mid 50s, maybe they're overweight, and their breathing had never been good. And in time, it caught up with them. The fact that they never really learned to inhale and breathe properly. But he would take these people, as long as they listened to him, he would work them, show them what to do, and if they listened to him, they could become successful again. So here again, it was he understood how the body worked, and he understood also how to teach how to use the body. So,
Nowadays we have this catchphrase, wind and song,
yeah.
wind and song. And through the course of the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 webinars, there's this reoccurring theme on how important it is for tuba players or all wind players to sing, like to sing a Bordoni study before playing it, for example. And I remember Mr. Jacobs in my first lesson. I said, Mr. Jacobs, I want to play for you the Vaughan Williams Concerto and Hungarian March. And I had 2 tubas there, Fountains of Rome. I was ready. I already got a job. I was ready to get his job. And I wanted to play all this stuff. He says, let me hear you play a scale. So I played a scale. And he said, is that the best sound you possibly could make? Probably not. Let's just play the first note with your best sound. And man, I played that note maybe 10 times until he said, is that your best sound? And I said, yes. He said, great. Do that again, then we'll play the second note. Now you connect this as a song? And then he took me through one of the Arban studies, but we changed it around. It was just do, 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 do. He would say, don't go on until you have played this with your best sound and the most musicality. So we worked on that for the whole lesson, and that's all I practiced for the first week. And every time I played a Bordoni or a Kolprash or everything like that, it had to be musical first, wind and song. And that was my takeaway from Mr. Jacobs.
This brings something to light. When you sing with the vocal cords, and when you play a brass instrument, you sing with your lips. And the connection between the brain and the production apparatus is pretty much the same system. It's just that you're not doing it here, you're doing it there. As far as you mentioned the Vaughan Williams, Vaughan Williams was concerto written for the tuba, but not really written for the instrument. Technically, if you compare it to the first Strauss horn concerto, that was written for the horn and also written for the instrument, and with flowing lines and third, fifth, octave intervals, much lyricism. But the Vaughan Williams really, in particular in the first and third movement, musically very interesting, but not written for the instrument. The secret here is to not to try to play it in tempo with all the staccato notes, but to practice it as a lyrical piece, phrase for phrase, very slowly, and on the basis of sound, tonal richness. And I always taught this, that anything that's articulated, if you take Kopros number 3 in F major, is that it's staccato F, staccato H notes. Any phrase has to be played lyrically first so that you have a singing line of sound to which the articulation is added. The German school was always the old traditional school, oriented very much toward articulation of starting the note, and the modern school, the school is the fact that the tone production on a brass wind instrument is essentially a lyrical function augmented by articulation, not an articulated function. And here in Germany, not so much now because we have wonderful tuba players here, but in the past, when I came here, say in the 60s and the 70s, the approach to playing was totally wrong. It was all short but Mr. Jacobs could do that very well, and he sang every note he played. He sang, and he was a very efficient player. He didn't have big lungs. But what he did with you was he did that with me as well. You know, I didn't really have much prepared when I went for my first lesson, but we started with the most basic studies of long tones and slurs and Arban. First, you had to master the first 39 pages of Arban before you went to anything else. It was advanced teaching.
It was revolutionary at its time.
Yeah, it was just logical. I came to the conclusion after a life of teaching and playing, just simple logic. If a person steps back from a situation and studies it and breaks it down to its elementary functions, it's all very logical. And I watched great vocal artists on the stage at the Bavarian State Opera, Desdemona dying and other people being stabbed. They learn to do this. They learn how to unfold their hands. They learn how to produce tears and create emotion. But really, it's just go to school and learn how to do it. Acting, blessed by singing, of course. But what we do is relatively simple as tuba players, particularly, or not so much solo. So solo literature is very, very advanced now, as advanced as any other brass wind instrument. But as far as orchestral playing is concerned and basic study, it's all actually very simple. Just think about what you do and prepare yourself accordingly.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Tucci, for tonight and your wisdom and your excitement and enthusiasm. And not only that, but inspiring others to create and do more than just play their tubas in the orchestra. And for those of you, before I say final goodbye and a final thank you to Mr. Tucci, a bit of a word from our sponsors, parentucci.com. So go ahead and put that into your browser and spend some time looking at that as Mr. Tucci's sponsor for tonight. And I am sponsored by the VIP Masterclass course. We have now 8 hours of tutorial videos in that Masterclass course. So thank you, Mr. Tucci, again for getting up so early and being with us today.
My pleasure. Two things. Anyone, any player, any musician, student, otherwise, is very welcome to contact me at bob@parentucci.com. And I have a lot of information on file, even personal responses to particular situations. But anyone is more than welcome, any tuba player, any musician, more than welcome to contact me, bob@parentucci.com, and it can be assured of getting a response as soon as possible. The other thing, of course, is that old tuba players never die. They just run out of air.
I like that one.
So work on your breathing.
Thank you, Mr. Tucci, and thank you for all of you who have attended all over the world. And thank you for those of you who are watching, listening to this recording. Same goes here, steve@tubamania.com. If you have any questions or want any help, tuba-wise, music-wise, life coaching maybe, I'm certified, please reach out. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Mr. Tucci.
Thank you for listening to me. And thank you for this opportunity, Steve. Okay?
All right. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to this episode of my Tuba Mania podcast series. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. Also, consider viewing the video version of this at the Steve Rosset YouTube channel, where you will also find many more resources for tuba and brass
I also invite you to become a member of Tuba Mania Online, which is free, so you can participate in webinars, such as the one with Mr. Tucci. And finally, I'd like to ask you to consider becoming a VIP at my VIP Masterclass course. The information there could be found at www.tubamania.com. Thank you again for listening to this podcast.